If you want to travel from Kano, Nigeria to Kinshasa, DRC, your best option is a flight with a layover in Cairo. Even when booking a month in advance and considering options across every day of the week, this flight, the cheapest with only one layover, is going to cost you $867 and take 13 hours and 15 minutes. And this is not the only route in West Africa that faces such unfavorable scheduling and pricing. In a region of the world with huge and expanding populations and increasingly shared economic ties, what is needed to better connect the air network and make travel affordable? Many people actually agree on the short answer: build a hub in West Africa. But the long answer, well, it's complicated. So today we're going to explore this. Let's look at the benefits of a West African air hub, explore why it really ought to be in Lagos, and outline what is still needed to get there. Welcome to Transit World, videos on all things transportation, with a focus on the developing world. There is incredible potential for aviation in Africa, especially West and Central Africa. Africa has 2% of global air passengers with 18% of the world's population. There are fewer than one commercial airplane per million people in Africa, 4 times lower than the global average. So why is that? Well, it may be true that fewer people in Africa can afford to fly compared to other parts of the world, a statement that is backed up by a strong correlation between GDP and flight metrics. However, Africa is growing its population and multiplying its middle class faster than just about anywhere else on Earth. Data are admittedly hard to come by, and the numbers vary by source, but according to the African Development Bank, Africa's middle class tripled between the 1980s and 2010s. And a more recent UN report states that 11% of Africans are actually upper middle class or better. That translates to a bit over 170 million people in Africa's upper middle class, enough to represent the world's 8th largest country. So even if the percentage of people that have the purchasing power to fly is lower in Africa than other parts of the world, there is still a large and rapidly growing population of people with the resources to fly. In other words, there's plenty of demand. What's missing is the supply. If we go back to our old friend, the gravity model, we can take a stab at analyzing how scheduled flights match up with demand. I've covered this model in previous videos, so feel free to check those out for more details on the basics of how this works. The main difference for this analysis is I'm using time in the denominator instead of distance. Here are some more details, so feel free to pause if you want to get a more precise understanding of my methodology. But the main takeaway is, well, the model isn't perfect, but generally speaking, anything over 20 typically has very strong demand, often with 10 plus flights per day. Pairs with 10 or better are very likely to have at least one daily flight, and there are many city pairs with scores of 1 or even lower that also have a daily flight. In Africa, there are 78 city pairs that score 10 or better. Let's adjust so that thicker lines show larger scores, and we can see that Lagos and Kinshasa stick out as the major nodes, followed by Cairo and a few other connections in East Africa. Lagos in particular is in the center of the network. 26 of the top 78 pairs include Lagos, more than any other city, including hubs in places like Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and Cairo. Of these 78 ranking city pairs, 34 do not have any direct service, and there's another 12 that have less than daily service. Together that's 46, over half of the routes. And for those 46, I went on Kayak and searched for tickets for about a month into the future, and asked it to show me what it deemed to be the quote-unquote best itinerary for any day during a 6-day period. 35 of the 46 are really just kind of rough trips. 24 have transfers which are well off the direct path, usually routing through hubs in East and North Africa. 2 required 2 separate transfers. 5 required self-transfers, typically through smaller airports or with smaller airlines, where service is not geared towards facilitating transfers. 3 had no shown routes whatsoever, itineraries that were so outrageous that even Kayak did not want to show them, which is saying a lot since Kayak gets pretty ambitious with their suggested routing. And that leaves 11 with reasonable itineraries. Keep in mind, we are just talking about schedules here, not factoring in prices. The average one-way price for the best flight on these 46 routes is $559. And that's for any flight over a 6-day period, 1 month out during the shoulder season. So these prices are really closer to the cheapest fares more than they are the average fares. So we have sparse scheduling and high ticket prices, which creates a negative feedback loop that leads to stunted airport demand for many of these city pairs. And this is not an equal issue everywhere. Cities in North Africa, East Africa, and South Africa are less impacted by these bad itineraries than cities are in West and Central Africa. So why is that? Well, those regions of Africa, outside of West Africa, all have one or more airports that serve as hubs for major airlines. Of the top 3 African airlines by fleet, there is one in each East, North, and South Africa. In fact, those 3 regions are homes to the top 8 African airlines. The only airline in the top 10 that is in West Africa is Air Peace, which comes in 9th place. Despite the fact that the largest city, the most populated country, and the densest corridors are all located in West Africa. West Africa is perhaps the most justified location for a new large airport hub anywhere in the world. A hub in West Africa, particularly Lagos, would not only better connect the people that live in that region, but greatly improve Pan-African travel in general. A major reason for this is that West Africa has nearly perfect natural hub geometry. Lagos is roughly equidistant from the continent's population centers along the Mediterranean to the north, the Horn of Africa to the east, and the Capes to the south. It's also much closer to the geographic population center of Africa, much more than any other existing hub. This helps optimize two things. First, connections. There are many city pairs where Lagos is on the way, where you could have a connection there without deviating much from your direct path. This is not true for all city pairs, but it is true for near the maximal amount of city pairs. Lagos also would help optimize scheduling. Most of the major population centers are all around the same time from Lagos, roughly 5 hours. So many routes will have similar flight times, which means that you can align schedules to create a strong hub-and-spoke pulse transfer system that makes connections convenient for passengers while minimizing downtime and maximizing utilization of your staff and airplanes. And speaking of airplanes, West Africa's centrality offers an advantage there too. A hub can offer service to any destination in Africa using narrow-bodied airplanes, even those that have only modest ranges. The most common airplane in Nigeria's largest airline is the 737-300, a relatively old airplane that does not have a remarkable range. However, even this airplane can service most of the major population centers in Africa from Lagos, apart from South Africa. A slightly newer 737-700 can reach all of Africa and a good chunk of Europe and the Middle East as well. And a newer narrow-body airplane with a long range, such as the Airbus 321neo, could easily reach any destination in Europe and the Middle East, plus parts of South Asia and even South America. Having such reach with a narrow-body fleet would provide competitive advantage since narrow-bodies are cheaper, both to buy and operate, more familiar, since most domestic and smaller airlines already use them. This means less time needed to train pilots and crew and less changes needed to ground operations. And they'd be more flexible, since you can move towards an airline that focuses most of its fleet on the same aircraft type for domestic, Pan-African, and many international flights. It's hard to say exactly how much of an advantage geography may offer, but the head of Nigeria's largest airline, Air Peace, recently stated that with a large hub in Lagos, Ethiopia and the rest will be a thing of the past in 10 years. Now that's a bold claim to make about an established carrier that's 5 times your size. Either way, this does all sound promising, but wouldn't these advantages be true for any city in West Africa? Why not focus a hub in Accra or Lomé or Abidjan, cities that already have larger percentages of international passengers? Why not Kinshasa, a city of roughly the same size as Lagos that is actually even closer to the population center of Africa? Why should the hub be in Lagos? Well, Lagos has more resources than anywhere else in the region. Not only is it a huge city, the largest in Africa by some metrics, it's also the economic hub of West Africa. Nigeria has a GDP higher than most other countries in West Africa combined, and Lagos itself accounts for roughly half of Nigeria's GDP. So Lagos has a large domestic base, and it's more interconnected to the global economy than some of its neighbors, since many people speak English. All of this means that Lagos already has engineering firms to design and expand airport facilities, logisticians from large domestic companies that can help manage complex schedules and operations, IT experts to install hardware and run software, and existing academic institutes to train and educate more people to do the above jobs, and many other. Lagos also has more existing airport infrastructure. The city's Moralta Mohammed International Airport is already the largest airport in West Africa, and it has undergone several expansions and modernization projects throughout its 80-year history, including a new international terminal, which just opened in 2022, and a renovation of the old international terminal, which is currently ongoing. And the airport certainly has faced its issues with overcrowding and capacity limits, but there is a plan in place to accommodate up to 20 million annual passengers, which would bring it on par with several airports that do operate as hubs. Lagos' size, industry, and expanding airport all help to foster economies of scale that you really just don't have anywhere else in the region. Of course, the big question is, why doesn't Lagos already have a big airport hub? Well, let's talk about that, but first, just my usual plea to please like and subscribe. I think clicking on the bell is good too, if you're so inclined. I always appreciate comments on topics to cover. So far, it seems like talking about Mexico and or talking about buses are the topics people like most, and I like them too, so more of that content on the way. Outside of that, what are some other systems or geographies or transit modes that you think are worth investigating? I really do love the comments, and the beauty of having such a small channel is I'm usually able to read each one. I typically only have time to reply to the ones that float to the top, but please do know that I receive and appreciate all the feedback, both supportive and constructive. I love making these videos, but they do take me forever. So I started a spin-off channel called TransitWorld, where I'll be posting lighter, easier to produce content with more frequency. It's mostly just me playing transportation-related trivia games. TransitWorld is a nod to the focus on games and trivia that the channel has. I think the channel is summed up pretty well by Sky Sini, who commented that my first video seems like it should have thousands of views. LOL. I'm at least 65% sure that's a compliment. So anyway, why doesn't Lagos have a major airport hub? Based on a bit of literature review, I would say there are really three major things that you need for an airport hub. The first is infrastructure, that physically allows the hub to exist, both tangible items like runways and people and processes for things like security. The second is a regulatory environment that is fairly enforced and encourages air travel. And the third is a strong airline that has economies of scale and the ability to grow. So let's look at where we are for each of these in Lagos. Infrastructure has historically caused a bottleneck, but there have been recent efforts to fix this. As I mentioned before, there is a lot of work currently to expand and renovate terminal buildings, with the stated goal to more than double their capacity in the coming years to over 20 million passengers. Airpeace also just launched construction in fall of 2025 on its first MRO facility in Lagos, a specialized center to conduct deep maintenance. So time will tell if infrastructure will remain a bottleneck, but there are certainly recent and ongoing construction projects which seem to address this in ways that really haven't happened in previous years. How about regulation? Let's look at the results of ICAO's safety audit to examine the state of laws and safety in Nigeria. This audit assesses whether a country has effectively and consistently implemented 8 different elements of a safety oversight system. So it does serve as a pretty good proxy for not just what laws are on the books, but also how well they are implemented and followed in practice. Nigeria scores 70% on the latest ICAO safety audit from 2023, which is up from 67% on the previous audit in 2016, and only a few percentage points below the global average. 2 particular areas for improvement listed in the audit are operations and air navigation services, both where Nigeria ranks more than 10 points below the global average. Amongst the flagged issues was observed fatigue of air traffic controllers. I am sure glad we don't have that problem here in the US. So anyway, this is all to say that the state of safety regulation in Nigeria is, well, not amazing, but also not bad. And it's seemingly improving with time, especially if you compare it to the state of the industry 20 to 30 years ago, when it really was notoriously unsafe. However, there are other regulatory issues outside of safety. Currently, Nigeria requires a visa for most people to enter the country, essentially anyone from outside of West Africa. And I can tell you from experience, the visa process is long and bureaucratic and expensive. Ostensibly, you don't need to apply for visa if you stay airside and do not pass through immigration in Lagos, but it does sound like this is not always possible if you need to transfer between the 2 international terminals, especially during the ongoing construction. Honestly, it's hard to get good details on the latest, so please do let me know in the comments if you're aware of what the current visa or immigration setup looks like. Also, Nigeria has historically been very hesitant to grant bilateral air service agreement Fifth Freedom rights, which would allow foreign airlines to set up a hub in Lagos if they want. This means that the only airlines that can create a hub in Nigeria are airlines based in Nigeria. This may be a sensible policy to protect your domestic aviation industry, but this brings us to the third pillar that's needed for a hub: a capable airline. There really has just not yet been an airline from Nigeria that has reached the operational economies of scale needed to prop up a hub and compete on the international scene. Nigeria Airways was the flagship carrier for the country from 1958 until it disbanded in 2003. But despite acting as a source of national pride and serving some international destinations, they never had a fleet larger than around 30 aircraft. Air Nigeria, also branded as Virgin Nigeria, had plans to create a hub in the wake of Nigeria Airways' fall, but they only managed a fleet of 12 airplanes before they were permanently shut down for failing safety checks 7 years after starting operations. At the same time, Arik Air made headlines when the relatively small and unknown airline placed an order for 5 777-300s and 2 747-8s, showing their really bold intentions. But long story short, and it is a long story, they ran into debt and dramatically downsized their operations to their current fleet of 10 narrowbodies. The largest airline currently is Airpeace, which operates around 30 aircraft at 20 destinations. So far, they've avoided the financial and safety issues which have impacted many of their predecessors. However, they are still only operating a relatively small fleet on a mostly domestic basis. It seems like there's some sort of glass ceiling, which is preventing Nigerian airlines from expanding past a few dozen aircraft. What's going on here? Well, there are many factors, but a large part of this has to do with Nigeria's uniquely risky reputation. Historically, there have been several airlines that leased airplanes and then either did not pay the lease payments or never returned the airplane at the end of the contract agreement. This, coupled with its historically poor safety record, has led Nigeria to be flagged as a particularly risky country for aviation. And that comes at a cost. Nigerian airlines are often prohibited from conventional airplane leases and either have to pay a premium or enter into a wet lease arrangement where more risk and operational burden is placed on the Nigerian carrier. And perhaps the biggest impact of risk relates to insurance. Nigerian operators report paying around 8 to 10% of the value of their airplanes in insurance fees, compared to only 2 to 3% in other African countries like Ghana or South Africa. So, a $10 million 737 may cost a Nigerian airline $1 million per year to insure, while costing only $200 to $300K in other parts of Africa. That's a $700,000 premium per airplane compared to its neighboring competition. So given all of this, how can Lagos reach its potential as a hub? Well, part of this is just to keep making the incremental changes that the country is already working to make. Keep expanding infrastructure at the airport, and keep improving regulatory enforcement and safety measures. But there are also 3 other specific steps that I think might be needed. The first is to streamline the transfer process. Ensure that international passengers are able to make transfers without having to pass through immigration. And perhaps you could consider providing travelers visa-free access for 48 hours if they're transferring. This would help make transfers easier and would also likely lead to more tourism and foreign exchange in Lagos. Second, I do think it would be beneficial to increase fifth freedom rights. This would allow for more competition, which would then help spur your own domestic airlines. And to help protect your domestic interests, this could be done bit by bit with specific airlines using reciprocity agreements, kind of along the lines of the limited agreement Nigeria just signed with Egypt in July of this year. And third, and most importantly, you really got to figure out a way to help domestic airlines scale up. This could be by following the model of Ethiopian Airlines, where the government directly funds the expansion of a national carrier, even operating at a loss if it determines that will be justified by the development of a strong airline and all the economic benefit that brings to the country. But Nigeria could also consider smaller measures that could still move the needle quite a bit. This could be offering favorable loan structures to airlines, and/or fostering a more robust domestic insurance industry that has the bandwidth to insure domestic airplanes at industry standard rates. I truly think establishing a Lagos hub would create a paradigm shift in the aviation industry in Africa. And yes, there will be externalities. More flights emit more carbon, and airports are large, locally undesirable land uses, especially those that are big hubs. But the benefits this could bring to the mobility and connectivity in Africa could be immense. In fact, I struggle to think of any other single project in the world that could impact more people for the better in the long run. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you next time.